Well, hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back aboard Titanic for our, I believe, third tour part of the ship, this time for third class or steerage spaces. Steerage being a residual word from much earlier days of clipper ships where the lowest paying passengers were once quartered directly over the ship's steering gear. That was no longer necessarily always the case aboard larger liners like this, but the name stuck. So here we are on the open third class promenade, also the poop deck, which is nothing to do with what it sounds. It's actually derived from a Latin or French word meaning aft or stern, which is exactly where we are. So there's a flagpole here with a very interesting blue flag. Anyone who may be familiar with the Merchant Navy, the British Merchant Navy, will know that generally merchant ships fly the red duster, the Union Jack with a red field background. This flag is blue, and that is the flag of the Royal Navy Reserve, of which Captain Smith, the Commodore of the White Star Line, was a commissioned officer. So he and other officers who commanded merchant ships were allowed to fly this flag rather than the red duster. This is the blue ensign, so that explains why this flag is the way it is. We have an auxiliary anchor here, which is quite heavy here on the stern. These windlasses are what I was referring to in the previous part of the tour in the crew spaces, where these giant crank mechanisms. There was also a room below us here where there was equipment to move these. You can wrap lines or chains around them using miniature steam engines. So this is what the top end of the windlass looked like with its brass cover. You can see these on the wreck on the forward, the forecastle deck. They're still very easily identifiable. Since this was a passenger promenade, there's benches placed throughout for their convenience. And passengers were not allowed up here, though. This is the docking bridge. This was used by quartermasters and officers in close maneuvering in a port to help make sure that the ship is where it needs to be and to help manage tugs. There's a helm, a binnacle, some engine telegraphs for commands, and a telephone here, and then on either end is a brass speaking tube, as you can see right here. And then I think this is a rolled up canvas covering for this space, although I could be wrong on that. I feel that I've seen photographs of something like that rigged up, but I could be wrong on what that is for. They also could be sounding spars? I don't remember. These are hatch covers above the third class public rooms down below us here. We'll get to those in a moment. These white, strange looking things are ventilator cowls. You'll see these on ships across the world of this era. Most liners still did not have central air regulation equipment, air conditioning or heating, and Titanic had these, and there's handles to move them around to help catch air and force it down into the lower parts of the ship. So that's what all of these are. Titanic did have fewer visible ventilators than other ships of the era because she had some slightly more sophisticated venting and fan equipment. We may be able to see fan rooms and whatnot at a later part of the tour. I don't think there's any accessible in third class, but we should get there. So these are cargo cranes to maneuver large shipments of stuff that the ship might be carrying down these cargo hatches that appear to be, at least their canvas coverings have been removed to let more light in. And then here is a winch to operate some of the deck equipment, move lines and whatnot. Down here is the well deck, which is sort of this gap between the raised second-class promenade up there. The enclosed second-class promenade is through that door on the right there. And this deck house, underneath the poop deck, there's sort of a covered area here. I think there might even... maybe it's on the other side. Ah, that's right. There's a water fountain over here on this side. Kind of a random place for it, but there you have it. Because this well deck here was also used as a third-class promenade, so this was sort of their outdoor recreational space. So it's sort of... it makes sense to have a water fountain there if people are out for a stroll. This is the top level of the third-class main staircase. Far less opulent than staircases we will see later in our tour of Titanic, but this was one of two main staircases for third class to bring them up through all of the various decks they had access to, and here at the top are the two main third-class public rooms that weren't necessarily specifically for eating, I suppose. This is the smoke room, the third-class smoke room, the domain of the men after dinner. As you can see, it's very hazy in here when you first walk in. And that's residual, as if there were some gentlemen that were only recently departed from this room. It's all paneled in oak with the green lino tiles that were common throughout the ship in third class and some crew spaces. The same pattern was used in all classes, but the coloring was how you could tell precisely which class you were in. The paintings on the walls, like many of the third-class public spaces, are various steamships owned and operated by the International Mercantile Marine. Titanic, like so many steamships of the era, and the entirety of the White Star Line, were owned by a conglomeration of companies under the management of J.P. Morgan. So Titanic was technically American-owned. Irish-built, British-operated, and American-owned. Olympic and Titanic, the largest steamers in the world. Oh, there's a pipe. So these spaces up here are actually, like, they're somewhat contrasting to the Spartan interpretation of what third class was on the Olympic class. This is somewhat of an inviting space, and if it were full of people, it would be even more so. I mean, unless you're an introvert, but be that as it may, it would still be kind of cozy. In here is the third class open space, which, in terms of layout and fittings, isn't dramatically different from the smoke room. It's just that there wouldn't be smoking in here. It functions essentially as the lounge for third class. Got sunbeams pouring in through the portholes here. It's a very bright and airy space. And the other thing that was somewhat uncommon for third class on other liners of the day is the furnishing of a Steinway piano for the entertainment of third class. This was not that common. It wasn't unheard of for musical instruments to be supplied by the company, but generally third class had to bring their own entertainment. They were the one passenger class that did not get any performances from the ship's orchestra. So we can head down the main staircase here into the ship. Passenger cabins further that way. This is D deck here. And then down on E deck is where there starts to be more things happening. So third class, as you can see, very quickly starts to become maze-like. And while there weren't any gates like you saw in the movie preventing third class passengers from getting places, they have chains up here in this demo sort of to prevent you from going places that aren't quite finished digitally. But if you didn't speak English, and many of the third-class passengers did not, this was still the era of vast numbers of immigrants into the United States before the Immigration Acts in the 1920s, which severely restricted the number of people that could enter the US. Many spoke languages from all over Europe, and the signage is all in English. Most of the crew only speaks English. And if you weren't fully familiarized with the layout of the ship, and the evacuation was rather cluttered. So while there wasn't necessarily an organized effort to prevent third-class passengers from getting topside, there also really wasn't any organized effort to help them get there. There were some stewards that did so on their own accord, but here's a pantry. This room would likely service all of the cabins on this deck and the decks immediately around it, as well as the two public rooms upstairs. So, various things that the passengers might need. We like to think of third class as basically getting nothing from the company the entire time, but no, you could, from your room, order something from the pantry. Even in steerage. Somewhere on this deck is, I believe, a cabin we can poke our head into, but I don't remember precisely where it is the problem. But this is Scotland Road, technically, the aft part of Scotland Road. You can see down into the cargo hatch openings here. Lots and lots of cabins. There were more third-class passengers booked aboard than any other class. Through those doors was the second-class main stairwell, which we won't go to quite yet, but we certainly will move on to second class next time. That goes down into engineering spaces. You can see now we've transitioned to wood decking. And this is one of the gangway doors that third-class passengers would board through. There were multiple of these throughout the ship, and indeed one on either side here. We can't see the other side, but there would be one on each side, just in case the ship needed to tie up on facing one way or the other. And in here was, in the previous tour, in the cruise tour, I mentioned there's a potato room. This is not the potato room, but it's how you get there. You can see sacks of potatoes there, but I think the potatoes were stored on the other side of that wall, or wooden door here. You can see a latch. So there'd be multiple tons of potatoes in that room. There's a hoist to move things between the galleys and whatnot. Now this is a portion of the cruise passage that we've already seen some of in our journeys through some of the crew spaces. You can see entrances to the engine rooms and whatnot. The engineering mess was that open door we just passed on the left. And then there's another somewhere in this vicinity. Let's see, I'll make sure I don't miss anything here. There may have been on E-deck. Yes. Let me run back here quick. There's one of the standard third-class cabins, because there were two types on board. One where you could have like a single family or even a single individual in a cabin, and then another type which was dormitory style. Let's see. I don't know precisely where it is. So this is... supposedly, I need to look right over here. Ah, here it is. So this is one of the standard cabins that you would receive for a third-class fare. As you can see, there's not much. Families had a slightly different arrangement, although I think this was probably for single women. because the single men would not receive a wash basin. So this must be... And as you can see, the walls don't go all the way to the top, to the ceiling. So there's a gap there, and as a result, there would be sound bleeding through everywhere, and it would not be a particularly privacy-conducive environment. But here's the two bunks with the White Star quilts and whatnot. There were instances of these quilts sneaking off the ship with passengers as they departed. That's how some of them still exist, at least in the case of Olympic. Alright, now we can head all the way aft, so I'll do so somewhat quicker this time. Oops. That's why I was confused. I was trying to use only the port side passage here, and got on the other side of the ship from the cabin that was open. So, again, we're passing sort of the engineering spaces, heading in the direction of some of the other third-class things to see. So this is the main part of Scotland Road, and there were two entrances to the third-class dining saloon. One was right here, and that was primarily because the dining saloon was not technically one room. They were separated into two. I was mentioning upstairs with the cabins that single women, single men, and families were all quartered in different parts of the ship, and that was to avoid impropriety, at least in the opinion of the line. Whether or not that was a widespread problem is unclear, but the sensibilities of the times sort of necessitated that kind of an action, and as a result, these groups also would eat in separate dining saloons. So this, in all likelihood, this watertight door would be shut in general operating procedure. It's left open for ease of exploration, and I forget whether the forward or aft dining saloon was, which one was which, but there were two, and I think they were just functionally identical for both rooms. It appears, I can't tell precisely what meal we have the dining saloon set for, but we can zoom in on this menu here, and it is readable, and it appears to be breakfast on the 14th of April. Or no, just all three meals. 4 if you count tea. Is tea a meal or a snack? Doesn't matter. So you could pause the video and learn precisely what it was that were some of the last meals served in third class. And indeed, for many of the people who ate in these rooms, that list right there was their last. So I suppose, again, it is important to remember through this entire tour the significance, the historical significance of everything we're seeing here. The course of history changed with the Titanic disaster. In first class, there were men who were politically inclined, who may have run for Senate or on the presidential ticket within a few years. And of course, we all know that this was sort of the eve of the First World War, and slightly different directions of the US presidency would have meant a world of difference, positive or negative, on world events. You can see lots of piping and electrical cabling and everything on the roof. All of this, despite the fact that this was both a crew and passenger passage, all of this is left exposed. And bare steel, we saw bare steel even in the smoke room, which was much more finely appointed. Than anything down here on E-Deck. We're moving forward in part because there's another cabin to sort of describe the alternative styles that were available, but also the last of the other major third-class public spaces. Now, it was sort of voids in the ship like this that were used to process incoming third-class passengers, because, again, a lot of them did not speak English and would have trouble finding their cabin, so stewards were escorting people places based on the numbers on their tickets, and that was a huge logistical thing on sailing day, and spaces like this were sort of holding centers while everyone got sorted out and where they needed to go. So this is actually a crew space we hadn't quite seen, because it was sort of fit in with third-class spaces. This is the Master-at-Arms' cabin. He was the security officer on board, and he may have even carried a weapon. I don't know if it was issued by White Star, or he would have carried his own, if at all. But in the movie, he's the guy with the handcuffs that arrests Jack and chains him to a pole in his cabin. The only problem is, this is what the cabin actually looked like, because it wasn't anywhere near the ship's side. You can see there's a porthole over there. In the movie, Jack's looking at a porthole as the water's rising, and there's a desk in here. Well, this cabin is significantly smaller than it would have made sense to have. This is sort of a standard, almost second-class fittings in this room, which is also useful because I don't believe this project has, at least currently, any second-class cabins available. So when we do move to second class, we'll only have the public rooms. But this gives you an idea of kind of what a second-class cabin would look like inside. And it is somewhat similar to what most of the officers had on board. And then directly across the hall, so we saw a standard third-class cabin at the other end of the ship. This is the dormitory style, which kind of fell out of favor shortly after the First World War, especially as the US began restricting immigration, and steerage eventually began transitioning across the liner industry towards tourist class. And these cabins were usually then split up into smaller ones for smaller numbers of people for added privacy and comfort, but there were a lot of these dormitory-style cabins on board at the time, and basically there'd be quite a few men in here. Generally, single men were bunked in this style, and then there'd be like a bench and a mirror, and that's what you would get. So I don't know precisely where you would put your things. I guess under the bunks. Oh, there's a shelf up there by the ceiling. I guess that helps. It's not a very big one. I would be one of those that would try to climb up this slanting wall to look out the porthole. It sounds like a terrible idea, but that's just, that would just be what I would be doing. Then you can see some more of these hatch covers that are here. I don't know if there would have been some other form of barrier to separate between the passenger spaces and the hatch cover void or not, but that's sort of what we have at the moment. Up these stairs is the covered third-class promenade. It functions as an interior space because really the only connection to the exterior is if they had removed all the coverings for this hatch cover, which seem to be partly removed at the moment. You can just barely see like the windows of the bridge and the forward funnel through that gap. But it's an open space, and this is in the movie where they have their third-class dance party. So they used the hatch covers as sort of a dance floor, and you can, like, Lovejoy comes down the stairs to look for Rose and that kind of stuff. But anyway, there's benches and things and tables set up in here, so it's a promenade, but it also sort of functions as a lounge to some extent. Each class had one of these panels. They're back illuminated at night. It's shut off at the moment, but it shows a map of the world in Edwardian 1912 with White Star Line steamship routes in dotted lines. And then the cities that are listed are ports of call that White Star had available. So this was kind of a useful thing. They didn't quite have like a tracker to show where the ship was for passengers to observe. In first class, they would put notices on the wall as to like the daily progress of the ship, but I don't know that they did that in the other classes. Perhaps they did, but I can't confirm that. But I think that actually might be sort of the extent that we can see of third class. The daylight streaming through. There might even be motes of dust drifting through the sunbeams. I've seen it before. Let's see if I can find one. Only because it's kind of fun. Yep, so you can sort of see dust drifting through the sunbeams there. These are some of the fans that I was talking about. Yeah, they would operate here. The manufacturing mark and model numbers. You can look up those serial numbers, and I'm sure it'll actually take you to, well, maybe not anymore, but so this is again the third class open space. I think that'll do it for today's tour. Tomorrow we will move on into second class and see primarily second class public rooms and some more outdoor promenade spaces and whatnot as well. And there may be some limited crew spaces that are only really accessible from that part of the ship that I may poke into as well. But for now, I think that'll call it for today. Thank you all for tuning in, those that might be, and have a fantastic rest of your day. I will see you in the next one.